Okay, my name is Dorian Hart. For many years, I was a game designer at Looking Glass, and then Irrational after that, and then uh, Blue Man Chew after that for a few years working remotely, and most recently doing some writing for C prompt games.
Amazing. Okay, can you give me just paint me a broad picture of your experience working at Looking Glass slash Irrational on some of these projects? Yeah, paint me a picture from your perspective.
All right. Well, from my point of view, almost my entire game design career was like being the imposter in a room full of really smart people. Like, because when I got to Looking Glass, it was all MIT people and brilliant programmers doing cutting edge stuff, and Austin Grossman, who is just an absolutely brilliant human being. Like, he's an author and a game designer and just a astute thinker. And
Hmm.
I was just some like liberal arts slum out of Wesleyan, where my entire experience was like I worked on one LARP the year before, and I could talk reasonably intelligently about the Ultima games with
Yep.
Paul Narath. Like, that was the entire. So I got there, and it was just like, what the heck am I doing here? Like, but I managed to scrabble through and ride a lot of coattails for 20 years. So that worked out pretty well. Um, in the year, I started on Ultima Underworld 2. That was
Okay.
and I was actually hired because they wanted an English major to do conversation trees. And that was a bunch of what I did, but they
Nice.
also needed more level design. So they taught me how to use a tile based editor, which was actually usable by an amateur, I didn't have any artistic skills, but I didn't
Right.
need it for that kind of thing. So I built the sewers and I worked on the castle, like the main castle level. I mean, just a bunch of miscellaneous level design for that. Um, and so I was with Looking Glass. I worked on that. I worked on System Shock 1, Terra Nova.
Shout outs to
The
Terra Nova. I think it's an underrated game.
ever, all 17 people who have played it think
Yeah.
that.
That was one
um,
of the first trailers I did for Nightdive Studios was for Terra Nova. I'm a big mech guy, so that was right in my
Very
wheelhouse.
good.
So I have a deep appreciation for it.
Uh, right. So Thief, and then System Shock 2. And then I wasn't on any particular project when Looking Glass went under. I was actually
Mhm.
on vacation, and when I came back, there was no Looking Glass.
Oh no.
Um, but then Ken brought me on at Irrational.
Nice.
I did some work on a game called The Lost, which was never released, and then Freedom Force and Freedom Force versus the Third Reich, which I was a co-lead designer on with Alex Kay, and then Bioshock.
Nice.
And when people ask me, "Oh, you designed video games? Anything I've heard of?" Like, Bioshock is the one
Yeah.
generally people have heard of. Though every once in a while, I get someone who goes berserk when they find out I worked on Thief, because
Right.
that had, in
The
my
old
experience,
heads.
had the most like fanatically loyal audience back in the day.
It was such a paradigm shift in terms of stealth and action and the combination of that and combat. Like it
Yeah,
was one of the first games where you didn't really want to fight. And that
exactly.
just
Yeah,
was like blew
that was the
people's
revelation
minds. Yeah.
that kind of, I don't know, turned the key in the lock of success for Thief, was
Yeah.
realizing that, like, because we spent some time like on the combat system and early on, and
Yeah. Yeah.
when
That's
we
what Paul was
realized
saying.
that
Like,
that was shouldn't be the focus. Like, that's when the game really became, that's, just the
yeah.
incredible thing that it was.
Yeah. And without Thief, we don't get something like Dishonored, which I think
Yep.
balances that combat and stealth um really well because you want to go in stealthy, but it's not a complete fail state if you end up having to fight a little bit. You're still capable in there. So um I thought that was a cool evolution of that. But yeah, Thief, man, that turned heads for sure. I mean, lots of these games that you've worked on, let's minus Terra Nova. You know,
Yeah.
they're huge. Like they had a huge impact, and you know, other than people coming up to you in the street being like, "Hey, I can't believe you wrote the quest lines for Ultima, the Ultima
Yeah.
Underworld." You know, how do you feel about that as a legacy in terms of like paving the way for immersive sims and that sort of thing? What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, well, I mean, I think it's great. Like,
Yeah.
it's the fact that I was kind of in the room while a subgenre was being invented, and that it has continued on, long past, when
Hmm.
my companies have dissolved,
Hmm.
is quite humbling. I mean, I personally don't take much credit for it, like, because I was not a big idea guy. Like,
Right.
great finer minds than I were like coming up with the notion of the immersive sim. I was just kind of an implementer in the background, but it was cool to be there. Like,
Yeah.
I did definitely had the sense that, like, I was in a, in the back roller coaster car on a roller coaster destined for great things.
Yeah.
And that was a terrible metaphor. I apologize. Don't
No, I
use
like it. I like it. I mean, you can't have all the left brainies have all the fun. You know, they needed someone
that.
in there to balance things out. You know, as an English major, how does your background sort of
Well,
influence your design
strangely,
philosophy?
my background ended up influencing very little, because every like when I got to Looking Glass, they had actually hired Austin Grossman for the job I applied for.
Of
Seriously,
course,
like, and
of
then
course.
7 months later, they realized they didn't have enough manpower. So they went through their list and started calling the people that they had rejected. And they got to me, and I was absolutely delighted to show
Yeah,
up.
yeah,
Um, so I did some writing there. Then my process was basically writing giant trees on a yellow pad,
nice.
and just doing my best to capture the characters and make the trees interesting and provide clarity and whatnot. But pretty soon, like I mean, I was either with Austin or with Ken Levine,
Hmm.
like, both of whom were far better writers than me, which is why I ultimately kind of found my niche as a numbers
Yeah.
mechanic. Because I also, I'm not a brilliant mathematician, but I know my way around discrete math, which is
Hmm.
really what you need the most of. Um, and then so that was, in as much as I had a process, it was complicated spreadsheets,
Yeah.
and synthesizing a lot of playtest data, um, and then with a sprinkling of playing the game myself to try to, you know, just get a sense of what, you don't want to balance something that you haven't actually played. Like, that would
Yeah.
just be ridiculous. And you learn pretty early on that playtest data only gets you so far, because the playtesters are way better at any game than any of the real audience is going to be.
Yeah.
So when all the playtesters are telling you this level is too easy, make it harder, like, you really have to resist
Yeah.
listening to them. Um,
Yeah.
so you kind of take the data as a whole and then figure out how to scale it up or down. So the playtest data might show you that level A is harder than level B, or they're having more trouble at some particular point than some other point, even if that trouble isn't very much. It's the relative
Mm.
experience that they're having is more important than the absolute experience they're having, because they quickly become ridiculously expert at everything.
Yeah.
And every once in a while, you'd get someone new, and then you would just, like, I would just stand over their
That was
shoulder and
precious, precious
watch the
data.
experience
Yeah.
they were having, because that's the experience that your players are going to have who actually
Yeah.
buy the game.
Yeah.
Um,
You were doing that. People were writing, people were designing big pictures. This was happening. How, what were some of the biggest challenges for you, um, balancing a game like that? You've got, some RPG mechanics, action elements. You've got to make sure it's tense with horror, so you don't want to be too powerful.
yeah.
Like, what do what are you
Oh
thinking about?
goodness.
How did you do that?
I don't know, by the seat of my pants most of the time. Um, but no, again, I'd read a lot of reports, and
Yeah.
we had data collection methods. And I played everything I balanced, I played as much as I possibly could. And
Hmm.
I had a secret advantage because I am lousy at video games and never got good at them, which
Nice.
meant I was always closer to a typical user than most of the other people in the companies playing the games.
Yep.
So I knew that if I was having trouble, like everyone would be having trouble, kind of thing, because I was fairly middle of the road. Um, you
Yeah.
say, like, I'm not sure that's a long or interesting enough answer to
No,
that
no, no, no. That's great.
open-ended
I mean,
question.
it is. It's
And I
open ended.
yeah, and I couldn't, as you say, with all the RPG elements that obviously made the games what they were. That made it really difficult to separate out all the variables. Because I was trying to spin a lot of plates at once. Like you kind of like you want to make sure that every weapon in a game has a place,
Hmm.
either a type of person who's going to enjoy it, or a type of enemy you're going to wish you had it for, or because nothing is perfectly linear.
Totally.
Um, because every obviously you can bump it, this weapon does 50% more damage than the previous weapon, etc. But we had all sorts of things where it's like, well, except that mechanical enemies are going to have some resistance to that weapon, whereas fleshy enemies will take extra damage, or vice
Yeah.
versa. So it was really just some, mostly real data analysis, but also just some, like, Zen gestalt, like just trying to understand how everything was fitting together. And I didn't always succeed at it. There are places, I mean, there's a level in System Shock that I did not even consciously understanding how good the playtesters were. I didn't dial the difficulty back enough, even
Mm,
though they were telling me it's plenty easy. Like I should have made it easier. Like
right. Right.
I think it was like the cargo holds. I think on one of the earlier levels, there's a place where you're going through back and forth through these hallways and getting assaulted by robots in these
Yeah.
cargo holds, and that was too hard. Even though all the feedback I was getting was, if anything, too easy.
Right.
And I kind of didn't listen to my gut enough, I guess.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. When you're, it's interesting because when you can have all that data and look at it, but then there is that gut instinct when you've been around a project for so long. And you have a feeling about it. It's that the zhuzh feeling. I don't know what to call it. It's just you you have it on the inside, and that's why someone like you is important because you can filter the guys who break games for a living, but then also make sure it's an engaging experience.
and I was always aiming for what I was calling like the ascending sine wave of difficulty.
Mm,
You don't want difficulty to just be a line that
yeah,
goes
linear curve.
easy
Yeah.
at the beginning to hard at the end. You want peaks and valleys. You want the game to get increasingly difficult, and then you find some tool um, that puts you on top of the heap for a
Mm,
while. Like, this enemy is kicking my butt, but finally I got the weapon, and now I'm going to spend an enjoyable 45 minutes just
yeah.
laying waste. But that can't be the whole rest of the game, because then you want it to ramp up again. So the whole thing ramps up over time. But if you take any little slice of time, you want there to be variables
Yeah.
where the the player and the game take turns being dominant.
Oh, I love that. The sine. What do you call it? The sine
An
curve.
ascending sine wave of
Ascending
difficulty.
sine rate of
It's
difficulty.
not
I love
static.
that.
It
I
kind of
love that. Yeah.
goes.
That's so good. The peaks and valleys I love too, especially with things like tension.
Mhm.
That and I can't even imagine, especially with something like Shock 2. It's like balancing for someone who goes with a bunch of psi and balancing for
Yeah.
someone who goes with a bunch of just physical damage. Like that hurts my
Yeah.
head. And then somewhere
I mean,
everyone in between.
the testers are great about that. Like we had a great QA team, and we could, people would be like, "I'm now going to play just using psi. I'm going to
Mhm.
just play never touching psi.
Mhm.
And I'm going to try to play balanced. I'm going to see if I can get through the game if I never find this weapon,
Mm.
because in the given how many people are going to buy it, you have to assume that things that feel like corner cases are going to happen to hundreds of people.
Yeah. Just by sheer
And
numbers.
when they have a terrible experience because you didn't test that corner case, they're going to go on message boards and complain. And like,
Yep.
you don't want that. So, it's kind of the laws of large numbers apply to video game audiences in a way that like is not immediately obvious. If you're going to have, something you might be tempted to think, oh, this is only going to happen to 1 out of 1,000 people. Like, why should I worry about it? Well, if you sell the game to 500,000 people, like 500 people are going to have that experience. Like they're all going to be angry, and you're going to hear it from them, and other people will hear it from them, and now you've got a problem.
Yep. Yeah.
That reminds me, I was trying to think of, because our correspondence was like, oh, if you think of any funny anecdotes you have.
Sure. Yeah.
And I could really only think of one that I remember, which was in the realm of explaining to my mother what I did for a living.
Amazing.
Which was a hard thing to explain, like, because she obviously has no context for anything. But in particular, so the Rickenbacker level of System Shock 2 was the actual physical layout is great. Late in the game, Ken decided that it just needed more going on in it. So I spent many late nights like going through the Rickenbacker, room by room, playing, feeling like, okay, nothing has happened in a few rooms. Like, I'm going to make something happen in this room. And at the time, one of our tools was you could make grubs like burst out of things. And I was just goofing around in one of the rooms that had a pool table in it. And I knew that players would search the pool table to see what was in it. So I made a trap, basically, that if you searched the pool table, like grubs would come flying out of the pockets of the pool table and attack you. And right around then was one of the times my mom called and asked, like, oh, what are you up to at work? And I was just like, well, today I made it so on this derelict spaceship, a bunch of alien worms would come flying out of a pool table. And there was this long silence at the other end of the phone.
That's great, honey. That's great, honey.
Broke my mother's brain with that answer.
Very cool. Appreciate you sharing that. That's awesome. Now that's going to be forever etched in my mind when I look at that pool table.
Yeah,
that's because Dorian made that. Needed, as Ken's words, needed something more.
Yes, and that
very
was
cool.
For better or worse, probably worse.
Well, especially in a point in the game where, let's call it a valley of tension, and then you have it with like an accent where whether it's a jump scare or just something that you weren't ready for.
Shock 2 is a game where you never really want the player to feel comfortable for too long. So.
Yeah, totally. Again, I'm gonna pick in the back of your brain. What do you have any favorite personal memories from the development of during your development time? Sleeping on a couch, reading something, the smell.
I mean, just generally, like, keep in mind, I was like my earlier experiences, I was in my mid-20s. I'm in a small team, with just working insane hours, which in hindsight was kind of grim, but at the time it felt like the greatest thing on earth, like, because I was designing video games, which is really, like many people, was like just a dream vocation. And so my fond memories of that time are like being in the office at 1 a.m, and everyone's just been crunching away and just like polishing and coming up with crazy ideas and seeing how they would work in practice. And then we'd all pile in a car and go to the local mall, to the like 24-hour Taco Bell, and buy Choco tacos, chatting about the game the whole way. And then we come back and I slept in the office a lot. Like, we had couches and a sleep room at cooking class. Like, you could just sleep there and wake up and keep working. So there was something, which is a weird thing I guess maybe it's the nostalgia talking, but I was really enjoying it at the time. It wasn't healthy in hindsight.
No, But when
put
everyone's on the
into
same
that.
page, and everyone's excited, I think it makes
Yeah.
stuff like that easier to do.
And back then, especially given just how brilliant all my coworkers were, like the things people were coming up with were things that were being things that people were coming up with for the first time anywhere.
Mhm.
Someone would have an idea, and like it wasn't like, oh, let's borrow from this game or that game. Like there wasn't anything to borrow from. Like every innovation that the early, the Underworld games and System Shock 1 had, like, was just built up from first principles by Mark LeBlanc and Doug Church and Tim Stelmach and
Mhm.
Dan Schmidt, all those guys. Like, so,
Very cool.
and I even and I remember I had a liberal arts degree. I had no programming skill, no technical skill. I had a handful of writing and discrete math classes, and that was about it. So I had a sense of being surrounded by greatness that I couldn't quite understand, but I could still tell it was greatness. Like I was just smart enough to know that I
Mhm.
was part of something potentially historic.
Very cool. Very cool. What are you most proud of?
What am I most proud of? I am most proud of a moment in System Shock 1 that I because that in particular you get these like rocket boots that you can use to like speed yourself up,
Mhm.
and and I play in one of the levels. This basically the architecture I built like a ramp, um, which was basically, so I wanted players to think like they're going to see that, and they're going to see I put some loot up on a little ledge on the opposite side of basically a ravine equivalent in a space station. And I was like, they're going to look at that and they're going to be like, oh, this is where I want to use my rocket boots. But I knew that they were going to want to do that. So I set up a trigger that if someone tried that and landed, it would like they would land and get the loot, but it would also open up a bunch of like sealed doors,
Mhm.
revealing turrets, and Shodan would pop in and say, "Nice jump." Um,
I love that. I
and it
remember
worked
that
by all
vividly.
accounts. I heard from people who fell into that trap and loved having fallen into that trap.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
It's again, thank you for sharing that. I love that. I remember that vividly when I was capturing footage, and every time I play, it takes me a couple tries to get that
mhm.
jump down with those boots.
Okay, so you know what I'm talking about, right?
I
Okay,
know exactly what you're talking about, and it's such a you jingle keys in front of a player,
yeah.
and players have been trained. It's like, okay, I get the thing if I do the thing, and then you flip it on its head and be like, actually, boom, you got to remember you're playing against this evil rampant AI. So, yeah, I know exactly the place in the game. That's cool. I appreciate that. Um, did you? Let's talk about your books for a second,
Okay.
if you want. I'm just curious about how you.
I don't know. I don't know if they're of general interest to your audience, but I can talk about them
Oh,
at
it's all nerd
exhausting
stuff.
length
It's
if you
all
want.
it's all nerd stuff. I mean, did you take any lessons, or was this a complete side thing? You're just like, I just want to write. Like, how did
I've
you get
always wanted.
into writing books now?
I mean, I went to college and got a creative writing degree
Fair.
because I always wanted to write fantasy. Like from the time I was 10 years old and wrote The Hobbit or
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
read The Hobbit, like I knew that that's what I wanted to do. It's like I want to someday I want to write books like that.
Cool.
But I never really had the time or the chance while I was working at Looking Glass and like because those were, you know, part of the reason I ultimately left Irrational was that I missed a year of one of my kids' lives crunching on
Hmm.
Bioshock. I
Hmm.
was literally at the office like 80 hours a week for a year.
Hmm.
And I could see that that was coming again for Bioshock Infinite. So that was one of my reasons I decided, now I was in my mid 40s, like, and
Yeah.
had kids. I was like, I can't go through this again.
Yeah.
But it did free up the time finally. So I postponed my writing career. So it's not that I have a career, um,
Ah,
but I
you've
finally had the chance to really write books.
amazing.
And so I did. I mean, I know this is like everyone wants to turn their Dungeons and Dragons campaign into books and thinks that's a good idea, which is not exactly what I did. I ran a like 15-year long Dungeons and Dragons campaign in
Wow.
there. It was the one thing I did make time for. And by the end of it, I had a ton of basically source material. So when I decided to
Nice.
write my books, I was like, well, I'll use this stuff as source material.
Nice.
Um, I'll strip out all the gaminess out of it because like D&D campaigns by their nature make terrible novels
Yeah.
because the demands of a player are very different than the demands of a reader.
Yeah.
Um, so I want to, in terms of character, in terms of pacing, you don't want to read a novel where there's a combat every hour.
Yeah. Or
Like
like deciding to pick every lock in the dungeon.
exactly. So, but I had run my game in a very narrative way, like which my players bought into. So it worked pretty well.
Very neat.
So I spent 10 years and I wrote 5 books.
Amazing.
And they sold decently,
Yep.
and people seem to like them. So
Awesome. I love that. And like
yeah.
everything I do now or anything I create now is influenced by something else. It just is work. But
Oh yeah, I borrow from all sorts of stuff. In
yeah.
fact, I had to be careful of that. Like when I was writing the books, I would be constantly paranoid that something in there I like didn't remember that I had borrowed it.
Right. You're like, is this an Ultima or is it not?
So I did.
Yeah. Cool. I wanted to give you room or if there's anything else you wanted to touch upon during your time at Looking Glass, I would love to give you some space to reflect on that. Or if you're good, I'm good. Yeah, the floor is yours.
I have very few claims to fame in this world, but I have one that that nobody knows is me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm pretty certain. I mean, obviously there could be parallel evolution, but I'm pretty certain that I'm the first person that uttered the phrase "first-person sneaker."
Oh,
Because when we were working on Thief, and like, it felt first person, and you were sword fighting, and first-person shooter was the dominant name of the genre at the time.
Yep.
Like, and in one meeting, I just kind of off the cuff was like, "Oh, we're making more of a first-person sneaker." Like, and I don't like. It kind of went unremarked, but then I realized, like, people started using that phrase more and more, and yeah, I'm sure other people thought of it in their own contexts, but
I love it.
I keep hearing people refer to the genre as that, and I'm like, oh,
awesome. First person sneaker. Okay, well, again, I just wanted to thank you for your time, and yeah, this has been amazing. The stories and the thoughts that you've given me here are awesome. So yeah, again, Dorian, I just can't thank you enough.
Oh, you're very welcome, and good luck with the project.